You can do everything right and still silently sabotage your child's speech. Not by neglect, not by lack of effort, but by making life so easy that words become unnecessary. Once you see this, you'll never interact with your toddler the same way again. You can do everything right and still feel like something is quietly going wrong. That's the part no one really prepares you for. You read to your toddler every night. You talk to them all day. You narrate your life, sing the songs, buy the books that promise to help them find their words. On the surface, it looks like you're doing exactly what you're supposed to do. But then there's that moment, the one that creeps in when the house is quiet. You realize they're still not talking, not the way other kids seem to be, not in the way you expected by now. And suddenly, a question you didn't invite starts taking up space in your head. What am I missing? I remember thinking, almost defensively, I'm doing more than enough. And that's what made it so unsettling. Because if effort alone was the answer, this shouldn't be happening. At first, I assumed it had to be something hidden, something medical, something beyond my control. That idea was strangely comforting. It meant there was a clear reason, a label, a fix. But the more I watched, the more uncomfortable a different thought became. What if nothing was wrong at all? What if the problem wasn't that my child couldn't talk, but that they didn't need to? That question hit harder than I expected because it forced me to look at the moments I had never questioned before. How quickly I stepped in, how often I filled the silence, how easily things were handed over without a single word being required. And once that idea took root, it refused to let go. Because if it was true, if we were unknowingly making life too easy, then the solution wouldn't be found in doing more. It would be found in doing something very different. And that's where this story really begins. Once that thought settled in, I couldn't unsee it. I had always assumed that speech delay lived in one of two places. Either something was medically wrong, or it was just a phase we had to wait out. Those explanations were neat. They gave me distance. They suggested the answer was somewhere outside the everyday moments happening right in front of me. But the more closely I paid attention, the less convincing that story became. What I started to notice was this quiet pattern, not in diagnoses or milestones, but in interactions, in how often words simply weren't required, how many needs were met before a sound ever had to leave my child's mouth. From their point of view, communication was already working, just not with words. That was the shift for me. Language, I realized, doesn't grow because a child hears more words. It grows because words become useful, necessary, worth the effort. And effort is the part we rarely talk about because it feels uncomfortable to admit that struggle has a role to play. But motivation is built in those small moments of friction. The pause before a response, the silence we don't rush to fill, the brief uncertainty where a child's brain has to decide, how do I get what I want now? When everything is immediate, efficient, and anticipated, there's no reason to search for a better tool. Pointing works. Sounds work. Looking works. From the inside, that's not delay, it's adaptation. This is why so many cases of toddler speech delay aren't rooted in ability at all. They're rooted in environment, not in a harmful way, but in a well-meaning one. An environment designed to be smooth, responsive, and easy. Once I understood that, the problem stopped feeling mysterious or frightening. It became practical, almost uncomfortable in its simplicity. Because if language develops when it's needed, then the real question isn't how to teach more words. It's how to design everyday moments where words actually matter again. And answering that question means looking very closely at the habits we rarely question. Once I began looking at everyday moments through that lens, patterns started appearing everywhere. Small, ordinary habits that seemed harmless, even loving, yet quietly removed the need for words. I noticed how quickly I learned to read my child's signals. A point toward the counter, and I was already moving. A glance at the fridge, and I was offering choices. From the outside, it looked like attentiveness. From the inside, though, there was no reason to reach for language. Needs were being met faster than words could ever arrive. I wasn't teaching communication. I was teaching efficiency. Then there was the talking. I used to believe that the more I spoke, the more language would soak in. So I filled the air constantly, describing, explaining, narrating. But when I slowed down and actually watched, I saw something else. My words were landing, but they weren't inviting a response. There was no space to step in, no turn to take. Conversation requires back and forth, not performance. Without pauses, language becomes background noise. I also realized how polished my sentences were. Full, complete adult language, said with the best intentions. But a toddler's brain isn't listening for elegance, it's scanning for signals. When everything comes wrapped in long explanations, the important words get lost. Short, repeated phrases stand out. They give the brain something to grab onto. Without that clarity, imitation becomes harder than it needs to be. Another moment that stayed with me was correction. Each time a word came out imperfectly, my instinct was to fix it. I thought I was helping, but what I saw over time was hesitation. Attempts slowed, confidence thinned. From a child's perspective, trying and being corrected doesn't feel like progress. It feels like failure. Language grows when attempts are met with understanding first, precision later. I began questioning the role of the tools I had relied on so heavily. The talking toys, the apps, the flashing lights that promised learning. They held attention, yes, but they didn't respond to intention. They didn't wait, misunderstand, or adjust. Language is social by nature. It's built through connection, not stimulation. When interaction is replaced by entertainment, words lose their purpose. And finally, there was help, constant, immediate help. I solved problems before frustration could even appear. Containers opened, puzzles fixed, toys made to work. It felt supportive. But struggle is often the moment where communication is born. When something doesn't work, the desire to express rises. When I removed every obstacle, I removed every reason to ask, to signal, to try. What tied all of these moments together was intention. None of them came from neglect. They came from care. From wanting to smooth the path, reduce discomfort, keep things moving. But language doesn't grow in smoothness. It grows in those brief moments where effort becomes worthwhile. Seeing that was uncomfortable because it meant the solution wasn't out there somewhere. It was embedded in routines I had never questioned. And once I saw it, I couldn't go back to moving as quickly, talking as much, or helping as automatically as before. Because every one of those habits, taken too far, quietly taught the same lesson. Words weren't necessary. And the moment words lose their necessity, they lose their power to grow. Once I understood that these habits weren't wrong, but simply overused, the next question felt almost unavoidable. If doing more wasn't the answer, then what actually helps? What surprised me most was how small the changes needed to be. There was no dramatic overhaul, no rigid system to follow. The shift happened in the spaces between actions. In the seconds I chose not to respond right away. In the moments I let silence exist without rushing to fill it. Those pauses felt uncomfortable at first, like I was withholding something important, but they were doing the opposite. They were giving space for intention to form. I began to notice how powerful it was to wait for any attempt, no matter how imperfect. A sound, a look, a reach paired with effort. When those attempts were met with warmth instead of correction, something softened. Communication stopped feeling risky. It started feeling worthwhile. What mattered wasn't teaching more words, but allowing attempts to succeed. When effort led to results, motivation followed. That's when language began to feel useful, not forced. There was also a quiet shift in my own mindset. I stopped measuring progress by how many words were spoken and started paying attention to engagement, eye contact, turn-taking, the desire to be understood. Those were the foundations I had been overlooking. None of this replaced professional support when it was needed, and it never dismissed the role of therapy in some cases. It simply reframed the everyday environment as something active, not neutral. And once I saw that, it became clear that helping wasn't about doing more. It was about creating just enough space for words to finally matter. And once that space began to exist, my view of my child shifted in a way I didn't expect. I stopped seeing silence as a problem to fix and started seeing it as information. Not a sign of failure, but a signal. A reminder that my child wasn't refusing language. They were responding perfectly to the environment I had created. When words weren't needed, they stayed dormant. When they mattered, they slowly began to surface. That realization carried a strange mix of relief and responsibility. Relief because it meant nothing was fundamentally broken. Responsibility because it meant the answer wasn't somewhere far away. It was woven into the smallest moments of our days. What stayed with me most was this simple truth. Children don't talk because we want them to. They talk because communication solves something for them. When it works, they try again. When it doesn't, they conserve their energy. So if there's one thing I would invite you to consider, it's this. Choose one habit to change, just one. Pause a little longer. Wait without rushing. Let effort come before help. Not to pressure your child, but to invite them, because your child already wants to connect. Sometimes, all they need is a reason for words to finally feel worth using. When I look back on this journey, what stays with me most isn't a specific technique or strategy. It's a shift in how I understand development itself. For a long time, I believed growth came from adding more words, more tools, more effort. But what I learned is that growth often comes from subtraction, from removing what gets in the way of intention. Language doesn't emerge because a child is surrounded by words. It emerges because words do something. They help a child influence their world, express a need, solve a problem, or connect with another human being. When those outcomes are already guaranteed without effort, language becomes optional, not because the child is lazy or delayed, but because their brain is efficient. The deeper lesson here isn't just about toddler speech. It's about how we, as adults, relate to discomfort. We rush to fix, to smooth, to rescue, often out of love. But in doing so, we sometimes remove the very conditions that allow growth to happen. This applies far beyond parenting. In relationships, in learning, even in our own emotional lives, progress often requires space, patience, and the willingness to let effort come before resolution. Applying this doesn't mean becoming distant or withholding care. It means becoming more intentional, pausing before responding, allowing room for struggle that is safe, supported, and temporary, trusting that capability develops when responsibility and opportunity meet. So as you move forward, don't ask yourself how to do more. Ask yourself where you might step back, just slightly, to let motivation rise naturally. Now I'd love to hear from you. Which habit do you feel you might need to change the most right now? Waiting longer, talking less, or helping less quickly? Please share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your perspective as well. And if this reflection resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these conversations going, and it gives me the motivation to keep creating thoughtful, practical content like this.